Hi everyone, it's Sophia from ATA Notes, and today I'm going to be taking you guys through the Prelim English July lecture where we're specifically going to be focusing on how to smash out your prelim exams. Just some housekeeping before we get started. This lecture is recorded so you guys can come back to it all the way up until your prelim exams next term, so don't feel any pressure to stay for the whole lecture. If you're not really keen or if it's getting a bit boring, there's so much that we're going to go through, so it's very understandable. I take no offense. But also if you have somewhere to go, don't feel pressured. Um, and don't push yourself. It's completely recorded, so you can come back to it. You can watch it in sections instead of watching the whole video. It's up to you. We also have these slides that I'm going to be using as downloadables. So if you go somewhere on the screen, there'll be a resource button. And if you press that resource button, you'll be able to download these slides and have access to them. So in saying that, you don't have to write notes or take down every point that I'm saying, because you can download them. If you want to do that, that's completely fine, but you can download them and follow along. You can just sit and listen. I'm going to be live in the chat during this lecture, so if you guys have any questions, just let me know. We can have a bit of a talk about year 12, about how you're finding English, any specific questions that you've got so far, and what to look forward to. But let's get started. Just a little bit about me before we go on. My name's Sophia. I graduated in 2021 with a 96.3 ATAR. I got a 47 out of 50 in extension English and a 93 in advanced English, and in my prelims for advanced I got a 39 out of 40. So you can trust me on this one. And I'm studying to become a high school English and business studies teacher. So I tutor English, I did English, and now I'm becoming an English teacher and I learn English at uni. So this is my whole life at this point, and you can very much trust me that I'm going to take you through all of this. So we've got so much to cover. We're going to look at essay skills, we're going to look at study skills, preparing for the short answer, preparing for the creative, approaching exam time, just all those general skills, because prelims is one of the first times that a lot of you will be sitting more of like a mock exam, and it's definitely building up to your trials and HSC that you're going to be sitting nearly in a year's time now. So I've got you covered. We'll be good. So, to begin, we're going to start with essay skills, which is all about creating an argument that elevates your analysis and really acing your essays. We're going to jump right in it and discuss the 5 components of a text. Now, I only say that because these are 5 things that every single text has, and they're conceptual and practical. And if you're integrating it, you can move away from those band 3 and those band 4 marks, and then even get higher and higher up to a band 6, depending on what you include when you're talking about these. You guys have already done at least 2 close textual studies. So you've already looked at least 2 texts. Now, whether that's 2 books or a book and a movie or whatever you've looked at in class, you've looked at least 2. So this is just going to help your general view of text as a whole. So expanded, they refer to this. So context, and context is what was the author's context versus ours. So the author's context is the time that they made it and the year and the period. Obviously, Shakespeare's context is going to be a very different context to ours, because Shakespeare was writing a lot of his works in the 1600s. Very different world, very different values compared to our values. Then there's the purpose, and what's the author's purpose? Are they trying to put out a message? Are they trying to challenge a stereotype? Are they trying to catalyze our reflection? Are they trying to make us think? We have to stop and think, okay, well, what's the purpose of it? The values are what values underpin the text. Is it the author's, and is it also ours? So some of the values might be forgiveness, redemption, respect, just some of those general values that a lot of the texts are about. Audience reception is how does the way we receive the text compare to the original context, and that's really got to do with our changing context and how our changing values. For example, we live in a much more secular society where there isn't as much influence from spirituality and religion. And I just finished our SOR lecture that we just did. So if anyone does SOR in year 12, you look a lot at the changing statistics in Australia, and Christianity has been on a major decline, and secularism, which is people claiming to be no religion at all, is on the rise and on the trend to, in a couple years, replace, and the most popular religion in Australia is set to be no religion. So that just shows, when you compare that to Shakespeare's society, which was very heavily Christian, and being able to compare the two, there's just a big difference that you can make on audience reception. And then we're going to talk about the form and then the different aspects of form. So context shapes text, but text shape context. I know that sounds so like back and forth, but we're going to look into it. Context is what you know, it's the circumstances of something. So the context can be political, so how the power is influencing the text, the political climate of the time. It can also be social, so it can be the features of the society. It can be literary, so how other techniques influence the prescribed text. So are other texts using the same techniques, or are they doing something completely different? Is your author going against the conventions in the traditional writing style of the time, or are they following it? And that's all got to do with the context, but also the personal context. And a lot of the time, the personal context has some of the most. I think personal and social are some of the easier ones to write about, because the personal context just comes up so much, and especially if the author's writing from their own experience, it does impact just their individual experiences when we're looking into context. So for political and for social, personal, literary, you can ask yourself these types of questions. So what was the composer's childhood like? What kind of education did they receive? What influence of their health? What's their relationship status? What's their gender? Are they a public figure? How are they perceived? Same with political systems. You can ask, well, who was in power at the time? What were the key policies? Were there any key historical events or wars? And all of that type of stuff is going to affect the type of text that you guys do. So if you guys are in the live chat, hopefully we can have a bit of a talk about what text you guys have done in class, and we can try and see if we can connect that to context. So values are essentially the concepts that are explored in your text. So different values are more prevalent during different contexts, while some values remain universally relevant. So our context affects the way that we receive and view values. So for example, the value of human connection is becoming more important in our modern context as technology gains popularity. Back in the maybe 1600s, when realistically what technology was there, human connection was just so natural and was just so inherent. It was kind of like instinct. But for us now, when we're so used to scrolling on TikTok and all over Insta, liking each other, texting each other, it's not as easy to have that human connection. A lot of people are losing human connection, and even stuff like artificial intelligence and people starting to start relationships with that. I saw the other day on TikTok, there's an AI dating app that's out there now. So you can date and talk to like an artificial intelligent robot. So you can imagine what that does for human connection. That's such a random example, but it's just a fact that as technology is gaining more popularity and as our social connection is changing, we now have to value human connection more because it's being threatened. But it wasn't being threatened back then, and that's the differences that you can make in context. There's a lot of universal values as well, and values at the core kind of stay the same, like gender, revenge, race, decay, religion, empowerment, jealousy, loyalty, love. They've been around forever. Shakespeare, Romeo and Juliet, love story. Love story. I don't care. I don't care. It's a love story. It's a love story, and the value is love. The value is love, but it's also looking at power, and these are like universal values that never change. So if you ever hear like, oh, universal value, universal theme, um it kind of like transcends times or something, there's like a timeless theme or timeless value, all that means is that it exists throughout time. And realistically, betrayal has existed all throughout time. All throughout time. Power has always been a thing. Gender has always been a thing. Revenge, go back to like the ancient Greeks, like this, it's always been a thing. And you can go back to mythology and go back to all these different wars, and all these values are there in history. So universal values and themes are just at the core across the whole universe. For just however long humans have been here, these have been our values, and they can kind of be recycled in new and exciting ways, like love now compared to love what would have been back then. Like maybe there's Romeo and Juliet back then, but now we've got like Instagram and dating apps, and that's going to really change how like people's love language and all of that. Um, that's just an example of how it can be the same value, but it can be portrayed in a new light for the sake of context, if that makes sense. Same with betrayal. A betrayal back then was an eye for an eye. So if you kill my brother, you know what? I'm going to go kill yours. We don't live in that type of society anymore where that's allowed. A betrayal now could be like going to be friends, having like a friend break up and then going to be friends with her ex-best friend or a girl that doesn't like her on purpose. That's a betrayal, and like a betrayal of like loyalty, for example. And that's just an example of how, yes, the value is the same, but it's going to be portrayed differently because of the sake of time changing. And as time changes, so do our values, so do our beliefs, so does legislation and what's socially acceptable. And you guys can even see, if you look at kids now, like I remember my parents were always like, oh, you kids and your technology, blah, blah, blah. But when I look at like younger kids now and how connected they are to iPads, we didn't grow up like that. We definitely grew up with technology, but it wasn't in the same way when you see those kids like with those grippy iPad cases like stuck to it. We weren't like that. And in such a small gap, how could things have changed so quickly? So imagine when there's hundreds of years apart, how quickly things are changing. It's very important um, to remember that. So you want to ask yourself how the composer is speaking through their text to influence you. All texts have a purpose, all of them have a message, and all the composers want to leave us with this type of message, and the purpose is shaped by their context and their values. So context and values are working together to shape meaning. And then the purpose is manifested through the techniques that they use. And sometimes they might use a metaphor or some really great imagery to show that purpose, and they won't be as specific, but it's up to the author and what they choose. Now, form is an explicit choice by the author, and it's the way in which the composer makes their purpose known. So the macro format is the text type. So is it a play? Is it a poem? Is it a fiction? Is it a speech? Is it a letter? While the micro is the literary conventions, and literary conventions, if you ever hear that, don't freak out. It literally just means the techniques. So is it satire? Is it rhyme? Is it repetition? Is it a simile? So the macro is the big thing, and the macro is really just the genre of the text. So what type of text is it? That's going to obviously influence the shape of the text, because a Shakespeare play is very different to a poem. But the micro is the techniques, and again, Shakespeare was using pretty different techniques to what we're using today. And a lot of dramatic irony, a lot of stage directions, because that's going to suit a play. But if you're doing a poem, you don't really need stage directions. And that's just the difference with the different texts. So form shapes the meaning of a text, and we perceive stories differently when they take different shapes. So a novel is not the same as a YouTube video, and a horror movie is not the same as a poem. So different forms can therefore highlight different values and different contexts of different texts. So then we get into audience reception, which is, what is the text impact on us? How does it make us feel? Does it make me re-question what I believed about this theme or this value? Does it consolidate what I already know? Does it just prove and be like, you know what, I already believe that, this just makes me believe it more? Does it challenge your belief and make you reflect and be like, wait, do I even think that? Or, oh, maybe my opinion has changed. And consider the extent to which we as the audience shape the meaning of a text. Is it us? Did he write that meaning? Is it for us? Is the meaning to make us think? It's just some important questions to ask yourself. So now that you know the 5 components, each aspect you can see feeds into each other. And I know it seems like, oh, there's context, oh my gosh, there's values, purpose, form, audience, like you're doing all these things at once, but all of them flow onto each other. And the only reason that we as an audience can even have that reception and we can question and we can be like, oh, is it a challenge? Is it a similarity? Is because of the context and because of the values that are so universal. So, for example, the Shakespeare context is Elizabeth, England. And if we're talking about Hamlet, it was a tragic play that he literally wrote for the Queen, and it explores revenge, deception, loyalty, and inner conflict. Here we've got Lion King, 1994, hundreds of years later. A kid's film, it's a musical, it's animated, and it's funny, but it explores revenge, deception, loyalty, and inner conflict. What's the similarity here? The actual universal values are exactly the same. And from there, that you can see that even though, imagine how different Hamlet is to the Lion King. How could I possibly sit here and compare Shakespeare to this kid's musical? But the fact that it's looking at the exact same values shows that different contexts, at the core, humanity is still the same, and it's still these same values at the core and at the foundation. So I just wanted to get that across. But by making sure that every element of your analysis is worthwhile and every element of your analysis is somehow linking to one of those themes, I promise you, you'll be able to answer any question you get. And a lot of the questions, especially in Year 11 Prelim English, are coming from those main 5 ideas. They're coming from context, they're coming from purpose, form, values, and audience reception. So I really recommend just knowing it in pretty good detail, and I hope that made sense. If it didn't and you have any questions to clarify, please ask in the live chat. But a lot of questions are coming straight from it. And you can even get something so basic like how does the author um, show how the values influenced the context? Or what was the purpose of writing this text? How does the author engage with audience reception? Something super simple, but it makes sure that you don't have to waffle and like teachers love it. Teachers love it, and it's just what they want to see, but not enough students are doing it. And even in year 12, this is still feedback that a lot of my tutoring students in year 12 coming close to their trials are still getting. It's like talk about the values, talk about the context. So if you guys can start doing that from now, I promise you it's really going to help out in your HSC and as you get into year 12 as well. So let's talk about what a paragraph is going to look like. I'm sure you guys did Peel, and I still use Peel to this day in university. I don't care if you did Peel, if you did Teal, it's a very good technique. But this is just more of a in-depth analysis where you'd start your paragraph with a really unique idea about that paragraph theme. You're going to do quote with the technique and then the effect of the technique. You want to link that to the audience and how that helps us understand the author's value. And then how then through that it achieves purpose, make a link to context, and then the audience reception, and then you'd repeat it 2 to 3 times depending on how many quotes to do. So that's essentially what you could do. I know looking at that is like makes you want to cry. It's kind of like pedal. But that's just an example. I know there's a lot there. But if you wanted to get at every single of the 5 elements at every single one, that is something that you could do. Others are going to look like this. And it's all going to vary. It was very important that you guys understand from year 11 is that there's no one way to do things. And I know that's annoying, and I know it'd be great if it's like, okay, everybody write this amount of quotes, everybody do this amount of paragraphs, everybody write about these themes, but it's just not how it is. And the point of English is that there is that potential for expression and that potential to kind of experiment with different things. So don't look at this. If you're looking at this and this makes no sense, which don't even feel embarrassed, because when I was first making these slides, and this is just the structure that we recommend here at ATAR Notes that's been working really well for a lot of our year 11 students in prelims. When I first was like putting these in, I was like, am I going to keep this in because I don't want to confuse anyone, because it can be really confusing. And even looking at it now, I'm like, there is a lot going on all at once. But realistically, each of these is all one section. So that's one quote, that's all for one quote, that's all for one quote, and that's all for one quote. I know it seems like a lot, but because it's all in terms of it, of the of what you're doing as well, it can seem overwhelming. But I promise when you actually write it, or even if you just wanted to try writing just that, like take a screenshot of it and you can like put it above your work and then write a paragraph or write like as part of it with that, I promise it will make more sense. So here's an example of how to do it. We even have it color coded for you guys so you guys can see. So we've got the intimacy of her metaphors, and then we've got the quote, so recognition of her confessional poetry as an authentic recount into the wounds she suffered as a result of her restrictions as mother, wife, and inability to assert her own identity. I'm not going to read the entire thing, guys, because you're 100% going to get tired of my voice by the end of it. So the last thing I need to do is start reading to you. But if you guys want to quickly have a read through of the rest of that, and we'll just have a quick talk about them. So if you guys had a read of that, hopefully that makes more sense. I feel like just looking at this like is so scary, but when you're looking at it here, everything kind of flows like onto each other and it all just works out. So hopefully that makes sense for you guys. Now, from the excerpt, you can see that all the bigger aspects of the text, so context, values, and purpose, depend on form so that they can be expressed, which is why your form is so important. And form literally is really just your techniques and the style of writing that they're following. And your quotes are going to speak about a certain value, and it's going to link to what the author's purpose in highlighting that value is. So this is an example, and this one is from an actual year 12 text, so you guys can get an idea of like the year 12 standard. I wanted to put something for you guys. But again, in year 12, you can still use this same format to make sure that you're linking back to all the ideas that you need to. So if you want to have a quick read of this one too about the reflective nature. So if you guys had a quick read of that, that's just another example. I'm so sorry, I just don't want to read them all out to you. But that's just another example, and I feel like I said, like looking at that, it is quite a lot. But when you see it written out loud, and I think that's the most important thing, and I definitely think that's a tip moving forward, is that you don't necessarily need to follow every single step. And I feel like sometimes, especially when you're looking at structural things, and it's like, okay, number one, do this, number two, do this, number three, do this, it's really overwhelming. But then when you see it finished and you see an exemplar or you see a sample of it being done, you're like, oh, that's actually not that hard. And it's actually not doing too much at one. It actually flows really nicely. So that's just another hint that when you are looking for stuff online, try to find, if you are going to look for structure and like past papers or any past essays that you're looking at, try to find work that has a sample and has an example of how to put that into practice, because it's not enough to just see this. Even I would still, if this was the first time that I had ever seen it, I would be so confused with how much is going on. So that's just an example of what to do. That's just an example of what to do. So now that you've got a crazy piece of analysis and you guys are all good to go for your technique, we're going to tie it onto your argument and your thesis. So as simple as it sounds, your thesis is the answer to the question. I know everyone's like, what's a thesis? What's a thesis? Your thesis is your answer to the question, and it's distilled into a few sentences. So it's the foundation of your essay, and it weaves all of those banging bits of the analysis together. So realistically, your thesis should answer the entire question in 1 to 2 sentences. That's your thesis. I feel like everyone's like, oh, like my themes, I gotta talk about this, I gotta talk about everything. No. Let's all drop it for a second. It's just your answer to the question in a few sentences. Now, it says a few, but getting it in 1 to 2 is great. Getting it in 1 sentence is very, very hard. And a lot of the time, even if you can do it in 1 sentence and you answer the question straight away in 1 sentence, it's really easy to just kind of skip past it and move on. But at least if you do a few sentences, and I say, like, I think 2 is the perfect amount. I don't want you guys to get into a habit where your theses are really dragged out and you're having like 4 or 5 sentence theses, because it's just not necessary. Because your thesis isn't your whole introduction, it's just the first part of it. It's just the answer to it. So you don't need it to be as long. And it does sound silly, but not answering the question is some of the most common feedback students get. To this day in year 12, and I would get it as well, not answering the question is some of the most common feedback. I'm sure some of you might have already gotten already, where it's like you haven't answered the question, you haven't answered the question. But the new syllabus is so big on questions, and the markers don't care. They don't care if you're like pulling off this like 20 out of 20 essay and it's like the best thing they've ever read. If you don't clearly answer the question, they will not give you a good mark. And especially with that, they're going to look at they're going to assume that you might have memorized too. So it's not worth it. So this is the guide that we're going to use for thesis, called Kite. Well, let's add an accent to the T. But we're going to look at thesis writing and just deconstructing it so you can build your whole essay argument. So the first part is the key words. And here it's emotions, thread, and to what extent and indifferent. I know it's so like underline the keywords, but even in year 12 we were still getting that same advice, and those keywords are so big for just pulling out like what words specifically you're going to use in your essay. So for that, there's empathy, isolation, and passion as emotion. For the thread is like a thread is being inextricably connected, and it can be for better or worse. The judgment, and whenever it says to what extent, guys, any question that ever says to what extent, please say the extent. You have to say to a high extent, to a low extent. It's a judgment. If you don't say the extent, you're not answering the question. And in different ways, for this one, you could talk about different tensions between empathy and apathy. It really just depends on what text you're talking about. So now we understand the question, and hopefully you have an idea of what the argument can be. Then you can transfer that interpretation into a thesis. And that's why a plan is so, so important in English. I think if you underline the key words and then you kind of like, I would literally, my planning for English would look like this, right? Underline or I'd highlight, and then I'd draw an arrow and I'd be like, what words does this remind me of? And what emotions am I going to talk about? And how am I going to say that it threads it? And am I going to say a high extent? And from there on, it's much easier to make that thesis and kind of draft it together. So the best way to learn how to write a thesis is to practice. And that's so, I know a lot of this advice is like, well, duh, but we need to get back to the basics. And the best way to learn how to write a thesis is to practice. Write them out first. And it is actually one of the best study techniques that you can do moving into year 12 is just writing more and more thesis. So what you could do text that explore this link, allow for the audience to reflect upon this. Indeed, through this examination, a composer may challenge this, prompting the audience to respond like this. That's just an example, like a general one. It doesn't have to be as detailed as that. It can be something shorter, but that's a way that you can fit a lot into just 2 sentences and really get straight to it. But thesis writing is so great. I really recommend that if you guys are studying, go to past questions and try out grab a past question. Instead of writing a whole essay to it, just write a thesis to it. Then grab another one, write another thesis to it. And that way you're exposing yourself to different questions without having to sit the full paper, because writing a full essay for maybe 10 different questions is crazy, but maybe you could write 10 theses in less than an hour. Very, very achievable. So let's pretend the question was through the telling and receiving of stories, we become more aware of ourselves and our shared human experiences. Explore this statement with close reference to your prescribed text. Then you'd have your thesis, texts which explore the shared human experience of collective ideology and power. And for this specific text, those are the themes. Allow the audience to be made aware of the prevalence in their own world. Indeed, through this examination, an author may challenge the pervasive nature of such power structures, thereby mobilizing the audience to respond in an equally critical manner. And that's just an example of how you could have that thesis, which again, 2 sentences straight to it, but looks at so much and really opens up and answers that question so, so well. I've got another one here that you guys can read. This is actually a year 12 one as well, just so you guys can get a feel at the standard. I know it's so freaky to say this, but like next school holidays, you guys, if you were to come to the lectures, you guys are going to do year 12 lectures. And you guys are about to start year 12. I know you still have the term and you still have your prelims, but year 11 goes by so quick and you're up to the last term. And then all of a sudden you're in year 12 and it's super serious. So I feel like for this lecture, I really tried to overlap some parts with year 12 because I don't want you guys to find that transition too much. And it's definitely a big transition. But if you get too comfortable in the level of year 11 English, the year 12 transition will feel even scarier. I don't want to freak you out. There's still the same, still essay writing, still creative writing, still short answers, but there's just a different expectation. And I want to introduce you guys to that expectation so you guys can see from now the level that we're going to try and work up to. But this is another interpretation of a thesis. And then we've just got the colors here so you can see how we're mixing in the textual purpose and the textual context and the values. Also audience reception. So the thesis therefore answer the question, but as we can see, they also expand on the question if needed. So the examples we've looked at often discuss the power of the author and ultimately audience understanding, but specifically at how the texts narrate our common life and what kind of warnings, or do they give any like implications, or are they assuming anything about our lives? Are they posing a counter narrative? Are they exploring some type of paradox? And that's what some of the more higher level essays can look into. So ideas that make for an effective thesis is a paradox, and saying, well, there's the paradox, which is just a juxtaposition between two things, by saying that it narrates our common life, and whether that's a positive narration or a negative narration is interesting, and you could explore that. Or also if it poses a counter narrative to what could our lives become. And that's especially if you guys, I know quite a few of my students are doing Handmaid's Tale, so if any of you guys have looked at Handmaid's Tale, that's where that would come up. So paradoxes and how it would be used in a thesis is when the question provides you with one or two contrasting ideas and you want to contrast it, or if it says something about complexity, paradoxes is definitely the way to go. Narrates our common life. It just allows reader to better understand the world around them. Narrates our common life is very much about audience perception, because it's narrating our common experience, and then it gives us space and time to reflect and critique on the time period or on our own. So it's very effective in that way as a thesis. And you can use it if the question seems to be something about the context. Narrates our common life is a great one to go to. But if you want to agree with the question and also add your own flair, that's something else that you can do. And then poses a counter narrative. Highly risky, because it's one of those questions where you're challenging the question and you're going against the criteria, but if necessary, do it. But most of the time when you get a question, you're going to say to a high extent, unless it's really, really false. And I won't get you wrong, once in year 12 they've done it in the HSC, and they've just given a statement that's been completely wrong and said to what extent. And so many students were used to saying to a high extent that they just wrote to a high extent, even though they were arguing to a low extent, and lost marks really easily there. So they can do it, but most of the time it is going to be to a high extent, so I don't want to freak you guys out. But we can see from our previous examples that they can really be changed slightly to incorporate these ideas, which is why if you kind of have like a general kind of understanding, and you know the main purpose, and you know the main context, and you know the main values of your text, there's not too much that you're going to have to change. You're only going to have to put it in terms of the question, but otherwise everything else is really going to stay as a bit of the base. So I can't stress this enough. Your thesis is your central argument. It's the most important part of your essay. Anytime you link back to anything, it should be back to the thesis, because your thesis is your whole essay. That's your answer to the question in the most simplified version possible. So you really want to nail it. You want to practice it until you can literally do them with your eyes closed. And definitely in the lead up to prelims, practicing thesis writing is so, so important. Don't expect your first thesis to be right. Even when I do thesis writing for my uni essays now, I don't just write one, I'm like, yep, great, I'm really happy with those 2 to 3 lines. I will rewrite it over and over again and keep editing and editing it until I'm really happy with it. It's definitely a risk in that way. But don't have that perfectionist mindset where like your first one just has to be the best one. The more that you practice, the better you do get, but you also always kind of find ways to improve. So now that you've written the first sentence of your intro, we're going to look at where that kite thing fits in, because you still have to introduce your paragraphs and your text, but all we've spoken about is your thesis. So this is what an actual introduction would look like when you're adding in longer and like a full introduction. So your thesis really only goes up until the pink. That's all your thesis. But you don't just stop at your thesis as if you're just going to write a thesis and then you're going to get straight into your paragraph. You haven't even mentioned what text you're talking about and when they were written and what themes you're specifically looking at and what your paragraph arguments are. So that's why you'd have these other sentences, and this is where we'd bring in kite. So let's rip it apart. So for the question, we've got, and expanding on it, we've got the interpretation, and then just adding some extra information just to get a little bit more into the analysis. Then we've got the text and the arguments, and that's where you're introducing your text and you're like, these are the arguments I'm going to make about my text. And then you've got a link that just links it back to the question and kind of expands on it, because you're not just going to end it on that argument paragraph. But you guys know how to write an intro. It's really just the thesis. The most important thing to remember is that by the end of your introduction, your marker already knows the type of range. They already know, okay, this is looking like a 17 to 20. This is looking like a 13 to 16. This is looking like a 9 to 12. They already know what grade they're thinking of. So you want to start it with a very high expectation that can then at least get lower, rather than starting with, my thesis is really basic, but my essay is really good, and then you have to impress them with that. You'd rather impress them to start with, and of course try to keep that level throughout and go at that straight level. But at least if your essay was to kind of fall short at some points, if you have that strong introduction, it's already starting really high up, which is always a really good goal. So let's look at the question in this line. Through comparing texts, one may better understand how textual form and values reflect an author's contextual time, which is true. If you compare one text to the other, especially if they're both about different contexts, then you can understand the context of that time better because you can see how different it is to another one. And although it seems to deal with similar subject matter, context is form and values. And it's got form and values and context, which are 3 of the 5 that we looked at. So I don't want to keep repeating myself in this lecture. I feel like I already am. But it's just an example of how it literally just keeps and keeps and going back to that. So that is an example from the module, which is looking at narratives from the past in the contemporary era. And that's actually a line. And that question was directly from that. So that's why module knowledge is really important. You guys can access the module by searching English Stage 6. Whether you're doing advanced or standard, and you can access the module. And I really do recommend it only because a lot of the questions are coming from here. So that gets the question. Then we've got the expansion. We've got the texts. And that's where you're kind of introducing it and like this text and that text and what they're doing. And then you've just got the link back, which is just a summary of what you said in the first sentence. But you guys know how to write instruction. I trust that. So let's talk about this one. What's wrong with this one? I want you guys to just have a read of this one. Have you guys found anything wrong with that one? And have a read of this one as well. Right. Hopefully you guys have been able to have a little bit of a skim through. But that was really that was honestly just to trick you guys. I just wanted to make sure that you guys knew in detail, and that as you were reading it, you were like, you know what, no, there's actually nothing wrong. Like, this is so good. What's wrong with it? And by sometimes using that, I would do it to myself too. And I would read exemplars and I'd be like, try to find something wrong, try to find something wrong. And by doing that, you kind of enhancing the pressure and kind of tricking yourself. It sounds a bit random, but you can't tell me that you didn't just look at that and think like, oh, what's wrong with it? You're trying to look for something, and you might have even found something really small that was wrong with it, and then you thought like, oh, like, is it this, is it that? And by doing that, you're finding even more areas that you can improve and that you can make it better. But all these texts are really balancing that argument and just getting into all of it and using the structure really well. So we've done intro. I already know that the paragraphs, you guys are already 90% an expert. We're going to go over some general stuff for paragraphs. But depending on the module, it's going to write, like, depending on how many paragraphs you have, and then the conclusion as well. Now, there's 4 different concepts to structure your paragraphs around. So let's talk about paragraphs for a bit. The most common one is themed paragraphs. And I always went for that every single time. I have actually never written any essay that has not been paragraphs based off my themes. You can do a character-based paragraph, but I just feel like doing a theme one is the strongest one, and it is more common in Year 12 as well. You can use a narrative structure and start like, well, this is the beginning of the text, this is the middle, this is the end. Or you can do an integrated where you're mixing everything together and you're doing theme and character. So this is Elizabeth with gender, or Elizabeth with power, for example, and connecting them together. It's up to you. It's not that one is necessarily better than the other, but as you prepare for Year 12, thematic paragraphs are what's most common and what really suits the modules. So thematic is just anything key to your text, and it's really just those values like revenge, power, agency, gender, religion, community, empowerment, decay, the list can go on. Character based is when you're looking at certain individuals and they're very character focused, and it really works best in plays and novels when you see them inside the monologue, not really much in like poems. You can't really get like much out of a character. The narrative structure is where you're using the textual arc, so you're going evidence from beginning, middle to end, and you're having like, this is a paragraph just on the beginning, this is a paragraph just on the middle, this is a paragraph just on the end. And the integrated is a comparative study, which is when you have two texts that you're comparing, which you guys might have done already, depending on what your school's up to, if you guys have done any comparative work. But that's all just to do with the similarities and differences, where you're like, okay, this is the first text, maybe this is the movie, or this is the second one. This is how they're similar, this is how they're different, but you do that in the same paragraph. So there are plot-based essays, and they're sort of overlooked, but you can do it and it can be useful. And that's where your flow goes from the introduction of the text, the middle of the text, and the ending of the text. And that's very much like the narrative plot that we just looked at then. But if you were to do that, and when you are doing this type of plot-based essay, it's best when there's a journey of the character. So when the character starts at point A, so maybe they're really upset in the beginning, then at point B they stop and they reconsider how they're feeling, and by point C they feel much better, they've learned a lesson, everything's great, all peace, love, live, laugh, love, whatever. That's just an example of how you're going to jump from the different structures and to show the journey. But otherwise, there's no real point, in my opinion, of doing a plot-based essay. I feel like themed-based essays and just having a theme paragraph is much stronger. But if you are going to talk about a journey of a character and how they get from point A to point C, it's going to work perfectly, because then your structure is actually mimicking the journey that they're going on. So when you're doing this, the themes of the text work together to produce the tension of the text. So the author still has their overlying purpose and message. They're going to have all these different themes, but the themes have the tension through the different characters, through the changing setting, plot, and the different relationships. So for example, you could have an introduction like this, which doesn't actually specify themes, it just has the overriding purpose, which means your themes can then be specified in your paragraphs and your topic sentences. And it's more about the journey that happens within it. That's an example of plot based. I just wanted to introduce it to you guys just in case you wanted to play around with it or you wanted to try it. But again, I don't want to keep repeating myself, but theme-based essays are so much more popular. And if you are interested in it, these slides are downloadable and you can access these if you want to try it, or even if you just want to have a go with the past text to try it out. Now, the pros is that it allows the analysis of themes to be really natural, and it's a great integration of form, and it's adaptable to many questions, but it is hard to integrate those themes and to integrate your thesis, and it also limits the ability to like move around and develop like one theme to the other. And also, if you wanted to like compare the ending to the beginning and you wanted to use quotes but you've already spoken about the beginning, like you just kind of mix yourself up there a bit. So I feel like I just said, like theme-based essays are a bit safer. And we're going to save integrated text and integrated essays, especially if you guys are picking, or sorry, if you're doing advanced English. There's a whole module on comparative study where you're just studying two texts and you're comparing them. And that's where integrated paragraphs come on, where you're going to bring the first quote from your first text, then the second quote, and you're going to kind of go back and forth between two texts and different quotes on how they talk about the same theme, but how they're portrayed similar in different ways. So that is to come, but it should not really be like that in year 11 unless your school is working on some comparatives. Let me know in the live chat. This is just an example I wanted you guys to just have, and again, it's a year 12 one, just to start getting ready to see what it's like, especially if you're doing advanced. If you're doing standard English, you don't have to worry about this. There is no comparative work. It's all set modules with just the one text, but for advanced, this is one of the modules, so if you wanted to have a read through, that is on the slides. Now, the most important thing is reading your text. I know I make jokes all the time about not reading your text because sometimes it can be so boring. And if you are studying a play, and especially with Shakespeare, I promise you watching the play is so much more fun than reading it. I remember we watched and we would go to the theater like for our school, like our English excursions would be to go watch, and I'm sure quite a few of you have experienced it too, but you can't tell me it's not entertaining. I feel like it's so much better than reading the books, especially Shakespeare. If you are studying Shakespeare, I really, really recommend No Fear. And if you haven't heard of it, it's those like blue cover books that on one side they've got the actual text, and on the other side, on the right side, they've got um like the English translation of it, and it actually makes sense. And it's kind of like Shakespeare's language on one, and like how Shakespeare would talk if he was alive today on the other. It helps so much. But reading the text is really important just to know the plot and for your own understanding. Um yeah, it's I don't like talking about it because it's easy to be like, yeah, read the text, but even when I was in year 12, like sitting there and forcing yourself to do it, especially when you're reading a text, even if you like to read, when you're reading a text for English, it's just such a different vibe because you have to analyze it and you're looking deeper, and you can't just read it to enjoy it. You're reading it to study. So it's just not the same vibe. But reading your text is very, very important. And as you're going through, write your thoughts down, have like a pen, have a doc if you keep like filling it up too much. But it's definitely my advice. And yeah, in the HSC, personally, I wouldn't, but, and personally, I didn't, sorry, not that I wouldn't. If I could go back, I would change a lot of things that I did in HSC personally, but there were, and I know people that were reading their text at least 4 times, the same book at least 4 times. They knew it inside out just before their trials and for their HSC, on at least having like 3 reads. Again, I don't like putting numbers and being like, you have to read it this many times, you have to read it that many times, you have to study this amount of times and this amount of hours and do this amount of questions. I don't like that kind of vibe and that kind of advice, because it's not like there has ever been only one way to get an A in English. There's so many different people who get A's in English, and they all do different things to study. Some people will go in with absolutely nothing prepared and pull off an A. Others will memorize an essay word for word and somehow still find a way to pull off an A and adapt it. Some people will just have notes and just memorize their quotes, still pull off an A. And all those 3 people can still get the same marks, even though they've done different things. So in saying this, don't think that like, oh my gosh, I have to read my year 11 text 3 times. No, you don't. If you wanted to, and if you have the time to, and if you want to push yourself, it's something you can get ready to. But I don't know. I only read it once and I watched it, so they can be happy with that. Now, notes in English is weird because you know that you're going to get assessed with an essay. You know you're going to get asked an essay question, or you know you're going to get asked with the short answer. So notes are a bit strange because it's like, I feel like compared to like your humanities subjects, or even if you've got notes for biology, for example, it's very much like memorizing the content and then applying it. But like notes for English are just a bit weird because you know there's so many different questions that they can give you. You know 100% you were going to get an essay question out of 20, especially for the essays. You will get an essay question. It'll be out of 20. You don't know what that essay question will be on, but you know it's going to be on an essay. So I am not a big lover of notes for English, and in year 12, notes for English just are a bit harder to work on because you're working on multiple different essays and you know that it's going to be essays. If you're using notes, I completely understand how that works, and I was doing it up until I think mid year 11, but from then on I made the switch to having an essay to study and like really working on like really trying to perfect like a really good draft and then going on from there. Um and that really works for me, and that helped me so much because, like I said, your quotes, your technique, your analysis never change. Even now, you guys going into an exam, you might memorize 6 quotes, maybe 8 quotes, maybe some of you 4 quotes. It just depends what your teachers are expecting. But either way, you memorize those quotes. Those quotes always have the same technique. They also always have the same meaning. They come from the same character. They come from the same setting. You're just going to prove that to a different point. Same with your themes. The theme is always going to have the same meaning. You're just going to prove that to a different point. So a lot of that stuff I kind of wrote into my essay, and I would practice putting in the module work, and then I would take kind of like a base essay and I would put it with different questions and be like, okay, how would I change it? What can I add to it? Let's try and perfect it and make this really broad general essay that I could then adapt. And that was so helpful for me. I definitely think I did that for my prelims, and I definitely think that's why I got 39 out of 40. I think that helped me so much, and that really made me jump in ranks and in marks. But yeah, it's up to you guys if you are looking at trying something new. I definitely recommend it. And if you have any questions, please just leave them in the chat. But you can do this as well. And I know a lot of people, and especially if you find notes online, a lot of them are using like an idea quote technique table. Up to you. Personally, I would just do flashcards. I kind of have flashcards with all of this, but I would just have them on flashcards because flashcards were easy for my memorizing. But it's up to you if that was something that you wanted to do. But you also, what's really important is just making rubric links. And we already saw how anomalies, paradoxes, inconsistencies. We saw how the different audience receptions and how um the purpose and the values and the context keeps coming up, and how they can just take like the module wording and just throw it in your face and throw it in so many different questions. So having that module, and that's why I really recommend guys search the module. If you were to write a practice essay, search the module, have it open in split screen, and go back and forth and think, okay, where can I add in this word? How can I drag it to this? Let me make a question out of the module. Would it answer this well? And use that as your guide, because all your questions, your prelim exam, every question is taken from the rubric, especially for the essays and even in the creative, they have to start with the rubric. And it won't really go outside of that, especially for the text. This is just a bit more on making your notes. Now you can make them really pretty. I was doing that in year 11 to like get myself to study, but as I got to year 12, I was like, I just don't have the time anymore. And whether you want to do them digitally, whether you want to handwrite, all of that stuff is completely up to you. Please do not listen to online advice and think like, I must handwrite, I must type, they must be pretty. A lot of online advice is like, you need to do this to get this ATAR, you need to do this many hours to get into this course or get into that. Please, if you take anything from this lecture, I promise you that's not how it is. I really, really promise you that's not how it is. Whatever works best for you. And maybe making your notes pretty, like other people are going to be like, oh, you're just making them pretty, like, you know, you don't even study them. Who cares? All outside noise doesn't matter. Whatever works for you. I know for me, in year 11, I really had to make them pretty, and that was what was motivating me to study. And other people would be like, oh, like, you just do it as a look at them. I was like, okay, keep talking. But then when I got to year 12, I kind of just found the style that was working for me, and other people like looked at like how I would do that essay in the base, and they were like, oh, you're not studying enough. And my friends would have like 10-15 pages of notes, and I'd have like 3 pages of like an essay, and that's all I'd be reading. And they'd be like, oh my gosh, how are you going to do well? You haven't studied enough, you're so underprepared. But then I'd still go in and I'd be completely fine. I was getting better marks than I had even in year 11. So don't listen to outside noise. I think it's great to take advice from the internet, but be very careful with the language that they're using. And especially if it's like this, you must do this to get this ATAR. And if you want a band 6, you have to be doing this. Not really how it works. A lot of people, like I said before in that analogy, so many people can get the same mark doing different things for English. So it's completely up to you. We are going to talk a little bit about the short answer section. This is just about defining and analyzing, but this is all stuff that you guys know from the body paragraph, so we're not too fussed. Let's quickly talk though about memorizing or not. So again, like I said, up to you if you want to memorize word for word. I know some of you watching might have memorized word for word before, and my only thing is that if you do that, you need to make sure that you adapt it to the question. If you go in and you write an essay word for word and you do not reference the question, you are not getting the marks. Even if it's a 20 out of 20 essay, you will not get the marks for that essay because it is not enough. So there is no definite answer. I personally didn't memorize my essays, but I did memorize like the note tables, which then you can obviously then use. And I kind of had that base essay memorized, not word for word, but I had all my quotes and just my arguments, and I kind of knew it. I was so familiar with it, and I just kept practicing it. It really worked for me. For other people, it's going to work to memorize a full essay, and that's great. But the only thing, if you do that, is that you need to make sure you're adapting it. Because if you don't reference the question, you're not going to get the marks. But don't think you need to memorize an essay. If you feel confident with it, if you understand it, if all this is making sense, you don't even need to. You can just memorize your quotes and go in on the day. And if you really have that strong understanding, I always did it just for myself, for my level of language in year 12 as well, because I was doing advanced English, and especially in some modules and even in standard across both. There's a module which is the critical and close study of literature, and they both have such a focus on sophisticated language, and really having like in-depth analysis where you kind of needed to know it a bit better, and doing it on the spot and writing these really great sentences with great vocab and really sophisticated syntax and everything is a bit difficult. So up to you if you want to memorize. I'm never going to say 100% do it, but I'm not going to say 100% don't do it. So it's up to you. Of course, naturally, no teacher's going to be sit here and be like, yep, you should memorize your essays, because they do want to test your skills. But realistically, a lot of the things will stay the same, and you can still test the skill of adaptability, which you can practice from home. Up to you if you're interested in doing that. But it can help you, especially with these criteria points that usually come up, which is like sustained precision, originality, and sophistication, textual detail, and critical personal response. Because when you're writing on the spot and it's the first time you're writing, it's very easy to not. I feel like I'm in a different world when I'm writing an essay, and like I don't even know what I'm writing. Like I'm just literally writing. So that's why I like having a couple phrases just down memorized, because I can write them down and I just know that they're true and they're right and they're strong. And then I can link them to the question and I just know that it works and it just fits in perfectly. But that's just an example of where it can help you. Again, not a must, but there's nothing wrong with it if you do. You just have to be very, very careful that you're adapting it, otherwise you're going to lose marks. And to practice adapting, you can do what I did, which is what I said before. I'd have different questions and I'd paste kind of that broad essay under, and then I just practice changing it. And I'd practice doing so many different thesis questions and just writing, like instead of seeing a full past paper, I would just, I was like, today, okay, I'm going to do 5 different theses and perfect them and work on them. And I still do that with my year 12s now. And it's one of the most effective study techniques to do, and it can really help you just answer the question and just understand it more. Because the more you kind of break into your thesis, the easier it is to keep making links back and the easier it is to get full marks. I think the thesis honestly is like the core of the essay, and that really can make or break your mark the stronger it is. And you don't want to just like throw in words. You really want it to try and aim for it to be like those theses that we saw before that were really, really standing out. So this is a disclaimer that a memorized essay is the foundation for your exam essay. Obviously not regurgitating, guys, and just putting it word for word, because you won't get the marks. And I want you guys to get the marks. We want the band sixes. We want the 20 out of 20. And here, there's obviously pros and cons of it. I don't want to go through all of it. I'm sure you know, and I'm sure like teachers have given talks on it. Again, a lot of people are doing it. A lot of people will say, oh no, I didn't memorize my essay, but a lot of people did. And a lot of the time when they're like, oh, did I memorize it? They're memorizing the foundation. Now, don't get me wrong, there are people who do pre-prepare it word for word. And it works for some people. A lot of people that do it doesn't work because you're not mentioning the question. It'll work if you do adapt it, but again, up to you. I don't want to go too much on about it. But for your prelims, it's really up to you. I think that you're much better off if you are doing it, have a foundation essay, which is what I did, and kind of just have like that base quotes. You know the quotes you're going to use, you know the techniques, and you know what they mean. And then you also have just a general kind of statement about the themes. Really important stuff. Now, if you are deciding to memorize an essay, how you're going to do it, you would just rewrite it over and over again, and you can just kind of say it out loud over and over again, whatever memorizing techniques work for you in your other subjects. For me, I would just have everything on flashcards, and then I would just practice with them. And once I felt confident with the flashcards and I could read them without looking at them, then I would write them out, and I would write out like my full analysis. I'd write out my quote technique and the analysis. And then from there, I could then practice actual practice questions where I could actually apply it. So that's my advice there. You can also record yourself if you wanted to, which saves yourself, and then you can listen back to it so you can kind of hear yourself. But personally, like, I'm going to say no because I don't want to hear my voice, and I'm already very tired of it from this lecture, in all honesty. You can speak out loud. That's what I was doing. You can do like sentence cover, different techniques. There's so much stuff online, but it really depends on what's working for you. But this is just a bit of stuff on pre-preparing versus what you're going to do in the exam. And again, sometimes like the question might be something super specific on a specific theme. So even though you've memorized your own themes, you have to make connections either way. And no matter what it is, you're not going to be able to use it word for word. you might be very good at predictions, and maybe you'll get very, very lucky that it's very close to it. But they know, and they actually changed the English syllabus on purpose because so many students were memorizing. So especially in creative writing, it's very hard to memorize. So this is just a little bit more on pre-preparing versus the exam because I wanted you guys to have access to the slides. Um, but it's up to you. You can go down that route if you want to. There's no shame in it. Like, I admit it. I know some people like don't like to admit it because like it's pretty flex to be like, yeah, I got a band six, but I didn't memorize my all I did was memorize my quotes. But I'm not gonna lie to you guys. I think I did the same in extension English, and that's why I also think I got 47 out of 50 because I just kind of had that base down, and I practiced changing that base so much. If I just had the base and I went in, there was no way I would have gotten the marks that I did. But I would take that base, and in my practice study time, I would practice it and writing it 2 different essay questions so I could practice adapting it. So that the first time that I went in to write the exam, a lot of people, the mistake that they make is the first time they ever write that essay is the day of the exam. So you can imagine that they're not really going to mention the question because they've never really mentioned the question before. But if you do practice questions and you practice adapting a memorized essay or like a foundation in some of those parts, 2 different questions, you practice that skill of adapting. So by the time you get to your actual prelims, you'll already be used to it. And that's kind of my advice there. Now for short answer prep, please just trust me. The technique is number -1. So however many marks it is, you're going to -1. So if it's a 3 marker, you're going to do 2 quotes. If it's a 4 marker, you're going to do 3 quotes. 5 marker, you're going to do 4. 6 marker, you're going to do 5. Now you can think like, oh, 16 out of 20 is really, really great. And it is a good mark, but it's so easy to do well in this section. It's actually the easiest place to gain marks, but it's very easy in saying that to lose marks because a lot of people aren't going in with preparation for it. You might think, oh, it's unseen, I can't study, but you can study techniques and their effects, which are going to come up every single time. And you can study by doing practice questions and exposing yourself to the different text types. For reference, they can give images, fiction extracts, non-fiction extracts, speeches, and feature articles. So you don't know what you're going to get, but you can prepare a couple techniques for each text type and know different techniques and their effects of them. So reading extracts and looking at past papers, adding in questions to the mix, even if you just search up some like satire cartoons and then asking yourself and kind of coming up with your own question, you'll start to see a pattern in what techniques you favor. I know for myself, and a big thing to remember with short answers is that you don't necessarily need these super fancy techniques. So you don't really need, like, antithesis is great, juxtaposition is great, but you'll still get the same marks if you do much more basic techniques. So personally for me, the techniques that I was using in my trials, my year 12 trials, I wrote about an exclamation mark. Like I said, the use of an exclamation mark emphasizes the human experience. Like, that was a physical sentence. And I remember writing that and thinking like, oh my gosh, I can't believe like I couldn't find a better technique, but I still got 4 out of 4. And whether you do an exclamation mark or you talk about something very simple like tone, or I don't know, past tense, present tense, first person, the use of I, or you talk about antithesis and anecdotes and analogies, you're going to get the same mark. So don't waste time. Of course, use the best technique that you find, but there will be people in prelims and in HSC, there's still people that go in, try to memorize and teach themselves all these really hard techniques, but then you're wasting your time trying to look for them. A lot of the time, you don't even understand what they're talking about. I still can't even spell anthropomorphism. Like, I'm not gonna lie, like, there's some really crazy techniques out there that just aren't even common. But tone, modality, past, present, future tense, first person, second person, third person, similes, metaphor, imagery, repetition. I'm not sure if I said modality yet, but those ones come up in nearly every text. In nearly all the text types, they'll come up. And the analysis and their effect stays the same. You're just linking it back to something different. So I really recommend just knowing some of those more basic techniques that are easier to spot. And if you're going to get the same mark either way, we just don't need to push ourselves too far. Obviously, find the best one that you can, but there's nothing wrong with using simple ones. So get that out of your head if you think that. It's unseen. They know that you have never seen these texts before, so obviously it's going to be a very different expectation compared to what the expectation was or the expectation is for your essays that you've been studying all year, or for a text that you did in February. They know that you've had the text all year. They're like, okay, well, better be a good essay then. Before the short answer, it's your first time ever seeing the text. So they're not going to expect you to pull out this crazy language and this crazy meaning and going on and on. Let's quickly talk about the creative prep, because you guys would have done the reading to write unit by now, most of you. We're just going to quickly go over some ultra speedy tips before we finish up this lecture. But much like everything in English, practice is so key. And with creative writing, you really want to experiment. Um, with the reading to write module in year 11, I kind of had one story, and what I did, I had different endings and different beginnings, and let me change up the character. Like one story, one version, he was really unlikable, and I tried on purpose to make the audience hate him, to transfer my message, which was discontent over the certain theme that I was talking about. But in another one, I made him like an unreliable narrator, where you're really on your toes because you're like, can I trust him? Like, I don't know what's going on. Kind of like if any of you guys have watched You on Netflix, with like that Dan from Gossip Girl guy. I forgot his name. I'm so sorry. But his internal monologue, you know that he doesn't want to keep committing these bad actions, but he still does physically. And it's so confusing. And you're like, who do I trust? Like, you're saying all this, like I'm in your head, but like you're acting out on this, and it's really confusing. That's another way that you can kind of spice up your creative writing. Another thing that you can do is add in letter writing, diary entry writing. Instead of writing it like beginning, middle, end, you can start with the end and then go backwards. You can start with a flashback. That's always something to add a little bit of a twist. There's all different things you can do, but I really recommend just experimenting. You guys do, unfortunately, whether you're doing standard or advanced, you have to do creative writing in HSC, and it's very sad. But yeah, it's such good practice now. And depending on your prelims, some of you guys won't even get assessed on it. I know for my prelim, we weren't assessed on it. We were just assessed on the essay and the short answer section. So it really depends how far your school is going with prelims. Let me know in the chat about that. But the answer is literally only limited by your imagination on what you can write about. Really focus on imagery, really focus on language. You can find prompts online. So just find like writing prompt. It doesn't have to be anything like super out there. But even if you want to, a lot of people are like, oh, don't trauma dump, don't trauma dump. But if you know one feeling that you've had in pretty good detail, or you've got a journal entry, or something has happened and you feel like it'd be a good story, make yourself the main character. Don't trauma dump. It's not therapy, but you can use that just as inspiration for your language, and you'll find that your language, when you're talking about your own feelings, is going to be a lot more authentic than language talking about feelings of what you assume. And I only say that because my first story that I wrote for year 12 was about depression, and thankfully I've never experienced depression, but I just kind of wrote what I thought it would feel like based on what I've like music I've listened to, movies and TV shows I've watched. My teachers, I still got a 17 out of 20. I was pretty happy with it, but my teachers were just like, it's so cliche. And I feel like that's a lot of the advice you'll get in creative writing, and maybe some of you guys got it as well. But they were just like, it's so cliche. And then my teacher asked me, like, have you ever been depressed? I was like, no. And then she's like, so why are you writing about depression? She's like, what do you know about depression? And I was like, oh, you're actually right. And then when I went back and for my trials, I actually ended up writing a story that was just a bit about expectations and pressure and validation, which wasn't necessarily my life, but it was all feelings that I had dealt with and that I was struggling with. And they loved it, and I jumped to a 19 in it. And my piece was super much simpler, but it was just more authentic to me. It was also so much quicker for me to write, and my language just naturally was better because it was feelings that I had felt and that I was struggling with and dealing with at the time. So that's not me saying go like talk about like whatever's going on in your life, but you can really tap into those feelings. And even if you want to tap in, like maybe you're feeling like excluded from a friendship, you can tap into the feeling of exclusion and then talk about exclusion in a family setting, or exclusion at school, or exclusion in a club. Like you don't necessarily have to like recreate. It's like, oh, my friend did this, like I'm gonna write a story about it. People do it, but you don't necessarily have to do that. You can kind of just take it and transform it. Now, when you're approaching the exam, what to do when you actually walk into the exam room is please stay calm. I know it's like so obvious, but it feels so weird, especially in prelims, like sitting in the rows and just sitting there waiting. I would kind of like have this monologue in my head, and like you're just waiting, you just want to get it over and done with. Um, I don't know. Personally, I don't like talking to people before exams, and I'm still like this with uni now. I just feel like everyone stresses me out. I feel like they're like, oh, what if we get this? What if we get that? Some people are like, oh, I haven't studied enough. Some people are like, oh, do you know about this? And they'll bring up like, when someone brings up a random point that you haven't even studied, and you're like, what are you talking about? What are you talking about? And then you start freaking out. I would just put my AirPods in before my exams for trials, HSC. I was like, nope, sorry, everybody. sorry everybody, I'm out. I would sit away. It's up to you and what deals with and what you feel good with. But if you feel like that kind of happens before exams and it really stresses you out, it's not worth it. It's not worth it. Just take yourself out the equation. And about the actual exam, reading time is for reading, so don't mark your paper, not even with your finger, because you can get in trouble for it. Read the questions first, like I said, because a lot of the time the question will give you a hint at what the text is about. So you don't have to read the poem and be like, I have no clue what's going on, because they'll tell you, oh, it's about this. And they'll say in the question, how does the author examine memory? How does the author examine laughter? So if you read the question first and you're like, oh, it's about memory, then when you're going through, you already know the question. You go like, okay, I just need to look for memory and I need to link it to the author. Okay, let me find 2 techniques, 3 techniques for this. And remember, please, that number -1. So however many marks it is, -1, that's how many quotes you're going to do. Now, why minus the 1 is because that -1 is your topic sentence. So let's say it's a 3 marker. 3 minus 1, 2. So 2 marks is for your 2 techniques and your 2 quotes for each of those techniques. And the 1 mark that we took away before is your topic sentence, which is answering the question. Approach the questions methodically. Keep sipping your water if you need it. Ask for more paper. Don't be embarrassed. And personally, I was like my handwriting was pretty big, so when I wouldn't like wait to get to the end and then ask. As soon as I got to like halfway through, put your hand up, because they take time. They take time and you don't have time to sit there. They're not going to give you extra time because, oh, you're waiting for paper. As soon as you get to halfway through, or even like that you're going to fill another page and you're on your last page, hand up. Hand up, because you don't want to waste time. We need to get it done. Don't worry. I know like there's always that person that's like taking like 100 extra booklets, and that's so bad that I put that in there because it was literally me. But it's really important. Like, you just have to remember, it's you versus you. Everyone studied their own way. Like, it is what it is, but it's really what you've done and the work that you've put in, and just trusting that. And it doesn't matter if people say, oh, you haven't studied enough. Oh, I don't like how you study. Oh, I can't believe you're doing this. Let them say whatever they want. You know what works best for you. You know how well you know the content and how comfortable and confident you are in it. And that's the best that you can do. So I always recommend approaching the exam in the order that it's written, only because the short answers ease you into it. The short answers are really easy marks to get, and then you kind of get built up to the essay. And a lot of the time, your short answers, you'll finish them quicker and you'll have at least 5 minutes extra to write your essay. While if you write your essay first, you can kind of get bogged down and kind of overdo it and just kind of waffle. But it's really just not that specific. And if you are going to do your essay first or your creative first, I only recommend it if you don't know it well. So for example, if you are going to the exam room and you still don't know your quotes, or you tried memorizing them right before and you still feel really nervous, write the essay or write the creative first, only because it'll be fresher in your mind, and then go back to the short answers. But make sure that you just leave enough time, and it depends how much timing your school is giving you guys, but just please make sure that you have enough time. Anyways, I'm going to wrap up the lecture here. I'm really sorry, guys. This was like a very big run through, and we went through like so much. Instead of going, it was really hard. We wanted to go through specific texts, but all of you guys do such different texts, so it's really a struggle to be like, okay, let's do Handmaid's Tale, let's do this specific prescribed text, when there's so many options for year 11, and we wanted to have a lecture that could kind of just be applicable to everyone. So I'm really sorry that I had to speed through some parts, but again, you can download these slides and you can come back to the recording if any of it didn't make sense. But please, any questions, I'm going to stick around. So please, anything in the live chat, I'm more than happy to help out with. I just want to say, I wish you guys the best. It's so impressive that from year 11, you guys are already here, and you're already like taking that step to get ready. I think that's so impressive. And it really shows a lot of initiative, because it is your school holidays as well. And for anyone watching live, it is 9:30. So I really do respect that. And I wish you guys all the best. I think that for your prelims, it's definitely a very stressful time. But just having that confidence in yourself. I know it's like, oh, believe and you'll succeed, like, obviously. But knowing that you're ready for each section, knowing the modules is so important. That's why I went through them, because if you know the modules, you know what they can ask you. You know that it's not going to get too much deeper. And the only real way they can throw you off is if they give you a theme. But if they were to give you a theme, you just connect it to your themes. And you can say whether it's similar or whether it's different. Like, it kind of is what it is in that sense. Up to you guys with memorizing essays. I wanted to talk a little bit about it from now, because I feel like year 11 is when it starts to happen more, and by year 12 a lot of people are doing it. No judgment, like I said, I had that like memorized kind of like base, and I memorized sections as well, but it's completely up to you and what works for you. Trying to think anything else for prelims. With short answers, really don't complicate your answer. Like, don't think that you need to write this super deep and philosophical meaning about the complexity of life and our inner child and traveling to the past and memory. Doesn't need to be something super deep. I remember in my HSC, one of the human experiences that I was writing about, there was a story about a girl going to the beach, and I didn't know what to write about because I had no clue what this story was about. I was like, she's literally just a girl at the beach. So I kind of waffled it out a bit, and I was like, oh, the author examines the experience of connecting with nature as the protagonist explores the beach. And I remember getting out of there, and everyone was like, oh my gosh, what should you write for this answer? What should you write for that answer? Everyone was talking about how like the beach was like a metaphor for um her discovery and her growth, and like it was just a central metaphor, and she wasn't actually at the beach, she was just dreaming it. I was like, what are these people talking about? And then when we went to go speak to our teacher, she was like, how good was the beach question? Like, you just had to write about going to the beach, and that was the human experience, and that was the answer. So sometimes it can feel like, oh, there's no way this is the right answer, there's no way this is smart enough to talk about, but I promise you that it is. And a lot of the time they try to trick people by giving really basic text that basic in meaning, but they've got so much like figurative language, and it's written so beautifully, and it's just crafted with so many metaphors and just really beautiful imagery that really kind of makes it hard to think like, oh, am I just not reading it right? And like, am I the problem? Like, am I just dumb, or is there like something else going on? But I promise you, you'll kind of get the vibe of what the text is about. And it's kind of generally always going to stem around disconnection, isolation, connection, human behavior, nature, memory, relationships, identity, growth, discovery. It's always around one of those topics. And remember, those, I know it like sounds weird to like give those like cliche kind of meanings and those cliche messages about how going outside your comfort zone helps you find yourself and exposes you to new risk and new possibilities, and creativity is the creativity unlocks the door to joy and to connection and to knowing yourself, whatever. It's going to sound cliche. It's English. We need to remember this. And waffling is fine. Waffling is fine if you do it the smart way. And the smart way to waffle is to make sure that you're doing a basic meaning. You've got the techniques that you need. You're not overdoing techniques by using, you're actually kind of waffling if you're using techniques that you don't even know how to use and trying to analyze them. You're better off actually just using techniques that you know and that work, and memorizing those techniques and their effects, because stuff like modality, especially if it's high modality, is always going to show certainty. Stuff like tone is always, tone can be different. It can be a positive tone, it can be a disappointed tone, it can be a reflective tone, but either way it's going to show the atmosphere, the mood of a character as they respond to an emotion or to an event. Like, that effect always stays the same. So you could just memorize that. And what I did, I had a quote table, and I memorized like this quote, this technique, and I did it for like my main quotes that I felt comfortable with. And then across all of my short answers in prelims and in trials and in HSC, I could just use that, and my technique and my effect was already done. All I had to do was find the actual quote and then link it back to the question. But a lot of people think like, oh, I'm not going to study for a short answer. Oh, it's unseen. I can't do anything. But I promise you, practice questions, practice questions, practice questions. Even if you have to go to year 12, practice questions, look at them, because they really do overlap. Um, and make up your own practice questions. Ask your teachers for practice questions. Get advice and feedback from your teachers, please. If your teachers will take marked work and will like give you feedback, like let's say you sit like a practice one and they like will give you feedback, get it. And let's say you get 17 out of 20, rewrite the question where you didn't get full marks, and then try to get full marks again, and just do it for yourself and for your own mindset. But otherwise, I'm sorry, I'm literally just rambling now. I'm going to be live on the chat for a bit if you guys have any questions. But thank you so much for coming to the lecture. We might see you again. And all the best with your prelims. If you guys are already ready for it from now, you're definitely going to smash it. Thank you.